The Leadville 100, Where Batter is Better, by Dan Kapke. Ken Chlouber, founder of Leadville's 100-mile ultra marathon, stared down from the announcer's platform at the finish line of Leadville's 100-mile mountain bike race. One of the men on the ground had made the mistake of asking if Ken could arrange to have the same kind of weather that the bikers were enjoying for our upcoming 100-mile trail run. To Ken, it seemed obvious. The man on the ground needed to be straightened out. "We're no wimpy bike riders," Ken declared. "We're ultra runners. We want high winds, freezing rain."
The better it is, the better we like it.
It's one of those special races, the kind you don't talk about entering without expecting to have your sanity questioned by people who don't understand what real fun is. Leadville, Colorado, 4 a.m., Saturday, August 19th, 1995. It began in the dark 2 hours before daybreak, as I stood thinking that I was prepared for what was to come. Had I known Ken Chlouber's weather wish was about to be granted, I might have been less optimistic. Waving so long to family and friends, we headed down the road to the west. 1 block later, I remembered what had been said at the pre-race briefing and switched on my flashlight. At that briefing, we had learned that less than 3 blocks into last year's 100-mile race, a man had stepped into a pothole in the dark and had broken his ankle. For his misfortune, the man had received the Jackass Award, presented annually to the entrant who, according to Ken, displays the greatest amount of stupidity during the 30-hour event. Though not a contender for the Jackass Award, I had my own lapse of intelligence at last year's race. I went out too fast and didn't eat enough. Somewhere around 70 miles into the race, I turned into a zombie, and by mile 92, I had serious doubts about being able to walk the last 8 miles. With that in mind, I started this year's race by walking from the start to the west edge of town. There I looked back and was surprised to find no one was there. The other 324 entrants were all ahead of me. A short time later, on a dark, unpaved road, I caught up with Ed Williams from Missouri. Walking briskly at a pace somewhere between 4 and 5 miles per hour, Ed was trying for his 10th Leadville finish. A huge silver and gold 1,000-mile belt buckle was waiting for him if he made it. Ed Williams is 66 years old. About 5.5 miles into the race, we arrived at the Turquoise Lake Dam and took to the trail. Glow sticks hanging from trees helped to keep us on course. From the dam, the trail led north along the east shore of the lake. Though we passed by several campgrounds, not many of the campers were up to see us. Those who were saw hundreds of flights floating by through the trees as the soft sounds of footfalls on the trail broke the stillness. Speaking as a former spectator, it's a magical scene, not quite real. A couple of miles north of the dam, the shoreline and trail made a gradual turn to the west. Several minutes after the turn, I heard voices and knew that Tabor Boat Ramp, mile 8, was near. Where the trail crossed the boat ramp, my wife Kathy, daughter Sarah, and friend Ken Chlouber were standing by to hand off food, fluids, and extra batteries. 5 miles west of Tabor, at the tail end of Turquoise Lake, we came out of the woods at May Queen Campground and left the trail. Daylight had arrived. Anxious to get to May Queen Aid Station, I hurried through the campground at a 10-minute per mile pace. May Queen, at mile 13.5, was our first aid station. Entering the Army-style tent from the east, I called out my number to check in, grabbed a bagel on the way by the food table, and checked out and left through the west end of the tent. All of the aid stations have cutoff times designed to keep you moving at a pace that will get you to the finish line within the 30-hour time limit of the race. Miss the cutoff at any of the aid stations, and your race is over. Half a mile up the road from the aid station, Kathy and Sarah were waiting with supplies at the Mill Creek trailhead. I jettisoned my flashlights, grabbed a fresh water bottle, and rock-hopped across Mill Creek. The trail above Mill Creek headed up the slope in a gradual ascent. By walking fast, I made better time on this section than some who walked the uphills and jogged the level sections. Half an hour above Mill Creek, the trail came to an end at Hagerman Road. Just before reaching the road, I heard the voice of Ken Chlouber encouraging some of the other entrants up the last steep stretch of trail. Ken had hiked up a mile up the road with 1 3/4 pounds of water to save me having to pack the extra weight from Mill Creek. As Ken returned down the road to his car, other entrants and I jogged and walked in the opposite direction. We walked about a mile on Hagerman Road before leaving it for a jeep road that climbed toward 11,200-foot Sugarloaf Pass. By then, the morning sky had turned dark, and I was in a hurry. My rain gear had been left with Kathy and Sarah back at Mill Creek. I crossed the pass ahead of the rain and set off down the hill at a leisurely jog. In spite of wearing tights, my quads felt chilled and tight. By taking it slow, I hoped they would survive the descent. Partway down, 66-year-old Ed Williams, no longer in walking mode, cruised by. Though not as fast as Ed, I eventually made it down to the blacktop road on the floor of the valley, mile 22, where a 3-member welcoming committee stood waiting in the drizzle with my rain gear. 3 miles later, the drizzle turned into a downpour. In my Gore-Tex jacket and garbage bag sack that had the bottom cut open so I could wear it like a skirt, I was not too bad off. Others were less fortunate. Warm overnight temperatures had caused most of the entrants to show up at the starting line dressed in shorts. Many of those around me still wore shorts. Some had no rain gear. I could not help but wonder as we headed down the valley, with the cold rain and wind in our faces, how those who were poorly dressed could generate enough heat to keep going. At mile 26, we turned from the center of the valley toward the timbered slopes to the west. As we neared the forest with the rain pouring down, I was following Ed Williams and barely noticed the person in street clothes running up the road ahead of us. The runner in street clothes turned out to be Sarah, hurrying to tell Mom and Ken that Dad was on the way. In spite of the rain, my spirits remained high, and upon reaching Kathy, Sarah, and Ken, I let go with "Singing in the Rain." Not much later, somewhere along the winding forest road, the wind suddenly went out of my sails. On what normally was an easy section of the course, the unpaved road had become drenched. Wet socks and puddles in both shoes made it seem like I wore ankle weights. Running and even walking became an effort. With nearly 70 miles to go, it was too early to be feeling so weary. My positive mental attitude went into a downward spiral. This is too hard, I began to think. I can't do this. Hope of staying ahead of the cutoff time ended, and my will to go on in the rain began to crumble. I prayed for better spirits and better weather, and recited the reasons to not wimp out. The reason that kept repeating was the memory of something Sarah once said when there was talk of me not finishing a marathon because of leg cramps. She had said, "My daddy won't quit. He's no quitter." At mile 32, we turned from the road onto the Colorado Trail and began the climb towards the northeast ridge of Mount Elbert. A short distance from the road, the trail became steep enough to make slow walking tiring. Amazingly, after trudging up the trail for several minutes, the exertion of the climb warmed me up, and my condition improved. Perhaps between the rain and the easy pace along the road, I had developed a case of hypothermia without realizing it. At any rate, when the trail crossed the ridge 20 minutes above the road, my spirits were rising, and I started to run. For several miles, the trail wound through the pines and aspens on the eastern slopes of Mount Elbert. The trail rose and fell as it passed from one watershed to the next. I jogged the levels and the downhills and walked the ups. My condition continued to improve, and I splashed past many on the soggy trail. In the pouring rain, I saw a woman who, out of habit, was about to cross a stream on a log to stay dry. "It's too late for that," I said, and splashed on through. She must have agreed because I heard her splash through behind me. Somewhere along the way, it occurred to me that I was a mutter. But while I had rediscovered good health and good spirits, some were cold and talked of dropping out. On the southeast slope of Mount Elbert, the trail slanted downwards, and after a 3-mile descent reached the floor of the valley at a place called Twin Lakes. The 40-mile aid station was at Twin Lakes, and race director Marilee O'Neill greeted me at the entrance. She was the proverbial lady in distress. To Marilee O'Neill and Ken Chlouber, the entrants and their crews who came to Leadville are nothing less than family. With the weather being what it was, Marilee was worried for us. I gave her a hug and bit my lip to keep from telling her that Ken was to blame for the weather. 4 hot cups of cocoa later, I headed back out to the rain. Kathy, Sarah, and Ken were waiting 2 blocks from the aid station at the edge of town. I stopped to put on some warmer tights, but soon wished I hadn't. Hypothermic thumbs that wouldn't work right, wet double-knotted shoelaces, and double-layered socks that wouldn't slide onto wet feet without bunching up added 15 minutes to the time that it should have taken to change. I left Twin Lakes in dry tights and socks, but the condition was temporary. A quarter of a mile later, the trail passed through a marsh with ankle-deep water. Beyond the marsh were series of knee-deep puddles, and after that came the creek. In a normal year, the creek was no more than knee-deep and 40 feet wide where we crossed, but it wasn't a normal year. Record winter snows and the day's heavy rain had combined to make this year's crossing a memorable experience. A rope had been stretched over the water and staked down on each side to help us cross. At the pre-race briefing, they had told us about crossing the creek and had left us with this warning: whatever you do, don't let go of the rope. From talk at the briefing, we knew beforehand how big the creek would be, but upon seeing it, I laughed. That's what people who understand what real fun is are supposed to do. With excitement running high, I stepped off the shore and started across. 40 feet later, the water was waist deep and cold enough to hurt. As the cold soaked in, I tried to hurry, but it was slow going. The current was strong and pulled hard on each foot that was lifted to walk. At one point in the channel, where the current was strongest, it took 2 tries to take 1 step. I started to wonder if everyone ahead of me had made it across. A little past the halfway point, the going became easier. I reached the south shore and set off at a brisk walk to warm up. 600 yards from the creek, the trail entered the forest on the south side of the valley and began to climb the 3,400 vertical feet to Hope Pass. A few minutes after I'd started the climb, the rain ended. Hooray. The course for the Leadville 100 is an out-and-back course with a halfway turnaround point located 5 miles south and west of Hope Pass. A mile below the timberline on the north side of Hope Pass, I met the lead runner on his way back to Leadville. I was 14 miles behind and losing ground fast. But, as it's been said about the Leadville 100, there's no disgrace in finishing last, only disappointment in not lasting to the finish. At Hope Pass, some 600 feet above timberline, there was no stopping to enjoy the scenery. I had enjoyed Hope's view a few days earlier doing a conditioning hike with some friends. The trail from the pass winding down to the south loses 2,800 vertical feet in 2.5 miles. Running down something that steep can trash your quads in a hurry, and it isn't much faster than walking, so I walked. 40 minutes after leaving the top, I reached the road on the floor of the valley where Kathy, Sarah, and crew for some of the other entrants were waiting. After unloading some clothing, I set off for the ghost town of Winfield, 2.5 miles up the valley. At Winfield, I met Harry Dupree on his way out of town. Harry, from Mustang, Oklahoma, was trying for his 11th Leadville finish. 2 years earlier, Harry had earned his 9th Leadville buckle and excited the spectators when he crossed the finish line just 15 seconds before the 30-hour cutoff. This year, Harry was doing something different. He was trying to catch up with his 30-year-old son, Chisholm, who had entered the race for the first time. During the second half of the race, entrants are allowed to take a pacer along to provide aid, comfort, and mental stability. Ken Chlouber, my designated pacer, greeted me at the Winfield aid tent. 4 minutes later, we were making tracks for Leadville, less than 40 minutes ahead of the cutoff time. With the later-than-expected departure from Winfield, it occurred to me as we headed down the road to Hope Pass Trail that it would be dark before we reached Twin Lakes. We weren't carrying flashlights, so Pacer Ken ran ahead to ask Kathy to go to the car to get some. The only other Nebraskan entered in the race, Michael McCurdy, owns a convenience store located 3 blocks from my house. 15 minutes after Ken had gone ahead, I saw Michael coming up the road towards me. He wasn't going to make the cutoff time at Winfield and told me to have fun as we passed. My legs felt weary, so I told him the fun part was over. Well, it turned out I was wrong. A short time later, as my waiting crew came into sight, I heard the voice of Leadville's Ken Chlouber behind me. I turned to walk backwards down the road, looked the race founder in the eye, and said, "The badder it is, the better we like it." Ken looked thoughtful for a second, and then repeated the words back to me. After the weather we'd been through, it was good to know that Leadville Ken was still a believer. At the trailhead, we stopped for 2 minutes with Kathy and Sarah, then Pacer Ken and I took off for the high country. Though Ken had paced previously from Twin Lakes to the finish, He had never been over Hope Pass. He had been told the 2.5-mile trail up the south side was pretty steep, but the warning didn't prepare him for the experience. 80 yards up from the bottom, he asked if the steep grade lasted all the way to the pass. With a few brief exceptions, it does. As we ascended, Leadville Ken and his pacer were often visible winding up the trail ahead of us. As he climbed, Leadville Ken's thoughts were for his son, Cole, a first-time entrant whose race had ended back in Winfield because of leg cramps. Though unable to finish the race himself, Cole had urged his dad to go on without him. Somewhere around the timberline, I pulled away from Pacer Ken and gradually closed the gap on the two ahead of me. I wanted to ask the race founder what the cutoff time was at Half Moon Aid Station, some 16 miles ahead of us. At Hope Pass, I followed Leadville Ken and his pacer across a large pass of snow that covered the trail. On the steep, muddy trail below the snow, several walkers momentarily held us up. When the last of the walkers had been passed, Leadville Ken and his pacer took off. I stayed with them through a couple of switchbacks before heeding the protests from my quads. I slowed to a more comfortable pace, and as they pulled away, hollered, "Goodbye, old man. See you in Leadville." 600 vertical feet below Hope Pass, at Timberline, I came to the collection of tents that made up Hope Aid Station. Supplies for this remote aid station are packed in by llamas. Llamas are also used to transport water to camp from a nearby lake. I ordered a cup of soup made with some of that llama-transported water, and it was very tasty. Pacer Ken arrived and topped off a couple of our water bottles, and I finished eating. Then, after thanking the volunteers, we were off. From the timberline, the trail wound down through the forest and lost altitude rapidly. To save wear and tear, I headed down from the aid station at a fast walk, while behind me Ken walked and jogged. Aided by gravity, we rolled downhill at better than 5 miles an hour with hardly any effort. The relaxed pace seemed right for rejuvenating weary legs, and as daylight began to fade, I felt ready to run. We picked up the pace to get as far down the trail as possible before darkness closed in. With the increased speed, Ken experienced some slippage problems on the muddy trail and had trouble keeping up. I kept thinking as we ran that in another 5 minutes we'd be using flashlights, but our eyes adjusted to the fading light, and we kept running down. Eventually, darkness overtook us, and we had to reduce our speed. A short time after dark, the long trip down ended as we came out of the forest on the floor of the valley. On our way to the creek, I decided to hold the flashlight between my teeth while crossing so it wouldn't be completely dark. That turned out to be unnecessary, however, as race director Mary Lee had arranged for a portable generator and floodlights to brighten the stream where we crossed. To further pamper us, a couple of hardy volunteers in wetsuits stood in the frigid water, waiting to help any who needed assistance. By steadying the rope and standing upstream to divert the current where it was the strongest, they assisted us all. Thanks for being there. As I finished crossing and stepped from the water on the north side of the creek, Pacer Ken entered the water on the south side. When he got across, he immediately hurried me away from a toasty bonfire to go splashing in the dark through cold puddles and marshes. At Twin Lakes, we found Kathy and Sarah and headed for the aid station to change into dry clothes. Sarah ran ahead with Ken and was applauded as a runner. She got a big kick out of that. After the changing clothes, it should be noted that my cold-blooded pacer became a happier man. 20 minutes before cutoff time, we left Twin Lakes and began the 3-mile climb to the southeast ridge of Mount Elbert. In the darkness, we wound upward through the pines and aspens, seldom seeing the lights of others who were doing the same. I did well during the steady climb, but when the trail crossed the ridge, my heart rate dropped off, and I had trouble remaining conscious. In spite of alternating a brisk walk with a slow jog, my mind tried to shut down. Several times I said to my pacer, "Talk to me, Ken," in the hopes that his words would keep me conscious. A little after midnight, we entered Half Moon Campground Aid Tent, mile 70. I plopped down in an empty chair next to Harry Dupree and Ed Williams and asked the aid station people if they had anything to keep me awake. They brought me coffee. I never liked coffee, but I took their brew and sipped it down. Before I'd finished, Ed told Harry it was time to go, and they headed off into the night. 23 minutes after Ken and I left the aid tent, Half Moon's 12:45 a.m. cutoff time automatically ended the race for more than 20 runners who hadn't passed through. At Leadville, Kirk App's race had also come to an end. Kirk of Crested Butte, Colorado, was first to finish with a time of 20 hours, 33 minutes. The first woman, Linda Lee of Santa Cruz, California, finished fifth overall in 22 hours and 59 minutes. At 2:20 a.m., we reached the driveway of the fish hatchery outward bound aid station, mile 77. Kathy was near the entrance, seated on the ground with a blanket wrapped around her to keep out the cold. Ken and I placed takeout orders with Kathy, then checked into the aid station and had a quick bowl of soup. On the way out of the driveway, Kathy handed us our requested supplies and wished us luck for the trip over Sugarloaf Pass. From the aid station, we followed a dark, deserted highway about a mile, then left the pavement to climb toward Sugarloaf Pass. Once or twice we saw lights winding upward below us, but they didn't gain ground, and for more than an hour, Ken and I had the woods and the night to ourselves. Around 4:15 a.m., we reached Sugarloaf Pass and started down the north side. Our pace during the ascent had been a good one, but once the pass was crossed and the work of climbing ended, my heart rate dropped, and I once again had to battle the Sandman. Fortunately, we caught up with 6 walkers, whose company helped restore my mental functions. After spending several minutes with the group, we eased by to travel at our own speed. Not much later, the rocky Jeep Road intersected with the smoother, leveler Hagerman Road, and we were able to pick up the pace. After a mile of easy travel along Hagerman Road, 3 glow sticks appeared in the darkness, hanging along the side of the road where the trail to Mill Creek began. Not long after leaving the road, I started to run out of steam as the effort of stepping over and around the rocks on the trail took its toll. The group we had passed 2 miles earlier went around us and pulled away. Time seemed to drag, and at our slow pace, the trail down to Mill Creek seemed to go on and on. About 5:45 a.m., we crossed Mill Creek and found my special someone waiting on the road with her blanket. She had food, fluids, and one last change of batteries for us. Without all the volunteers and all the special someones, a lot of us who made it to the finish would never have done so. From Mill Creek, we walked and jogged down the road to May Queen Aid Tent. At May Queen, I ordered a bowl of potato soup and sat down in a chair to eat. A guy from our campground who dropped from the race early came over and gave me a massage while I ate. The soup was delicious and the massage felt wonderful. When the first bowl of soup disappeared, I asked Pacer Ken to bring me another. The second bowl went down almost as quickly as the first, and I considered having a third. But before I could order, the massage ended and my masseuse told me it was time to go. From May Queen, we jogged down the road to the lake trail and then slowed to a walk, intending to wait for daylight before doing any more off-road running. The sky grew light, but I wasn't able to do much running and progress was slow. Kind of like walking up and down escalator. At Tabor Boat Ramp, mile 92, I was in my let's get this finished mode and barely slowed down to drop off a flashlight and exchange water bottles. Ken paused for a few seconds with Kathy and Sarah, but caught up with me quickly. There was no run left in my legs, but I sped up my walk so that Ken had to jog for a few seconds each 50 yards to keep up. The lake trail ended, and we descended down a steep Jeep road to the gravel road below the dam. It was the last steep descent of the race, and I was relieved when it was over, as my quads were about spent. A few minutes after Ken and I reached the gravel road, we started talking PR. To make it happen, we tried jogging 100 steps, then walking 100. After the first couple of cycles, the jogging became easier. As expected, we found Kathy and Sarah waiting where the gravel road reached the blacktop, 4.5 miles from the finish. Ken stopped for a moment, but I grabbed food and fluids from Sarah on the fly. A few seconds later, my 100-step jog cycle ended, but I felt too good to slow to a walk. Instead, I picked up the pace. 3 minutes later, where the course turned south off the pavement, I looked back to see how Pacer Ken was doing. He was about 50 yards back and running well. I eased off until Ken caught up, and then we headed down the gravel road at less than 9 minutes per mile. After all the miles I had walked with no run in my legs, to suddenly run without effort seemed a miracle. At our rapid pace, we passed by several other entrants in a few minutes' time. Among them was Harry Dupree, who had caught up with his son after 87 miles. A little farther down the road, we overtook a determined Ed Williams. Ed was traveling solo. His breathing sounded labored. We slipped past quietly so as not to break his concentration. About half a mile after leaving the pavement, Ken suggested it might be wise to slow down and walk for a while. But it's not too often a plotter like me gets to feel like an elite runner, so we ran a bit further. With 3.3 miles to go, we did slow to a walk where the road turned rocky and steep. A short distance later, the road became less steep, and we could see other entrants and pacers scattered to the next bend in the road nearly half a mile ahead. By the end of the race, all who we'd seen in that half-mile stretch were behind us, but not because we were faster runners. The road had leveled off enough to run again, and we gave it a try. But during the course of our short walk, my elite runner status had become a memory. 20 stiff-legged steps of jogging were all that it took to convince me that running was not the way. We walked fast, ate on the go, and kept passing other walkers who were no doubt as happy as we were, that through rain and wind and weather they had kept their doggies rolling. Then, almost before I was ready for it to happen, we were on the hill at the outskirts of town where the finish line comes into view. Down our hill and 4 blocks up, the next was a red carpet rolled out in the street and a small crowd to welcome us home. It was like looking at the promised land after wandering through the wilderness. Ken offered congratulations, but my vision had blurred and I couldn't speak. From half a mile out, we started our run to the finish. 4 blocks later, as we started up the hill for the last quarter mile, a walking man 100 yards ahead of us turned to look back before he started to run. I recognized the man, turned to my pacer and blurted out, "Ken, it's Ken." Then, overwhelmed by a surge of adrenaline, I began to accelerate, closing the gap on my friend up ahead. The thought of passing the race founder 100 yards from the finish seemed a bit sacrilegious. But there were some girls up the hill that I needed to see, and I knew Leadville Ken would forgive me.
Next we have Robert Reed, number 361.
Good job.
34 finisher today.
Good run.
Here comes the and here's somebody you've all seen before.
Entrants in the 1995 Leadville 100 came from 41 states and 6 foreign countries. Of the 325 entrants who started the race, 15 women and 115 men completed the course. 66-year-old Ed Williams earned his 1,000-mile silver belt buckle. Harry Dupree came in with his son, and I finished younger than when I began.
Okay, that's all I need to say. The
Yeah.
battered is.
No.
Or you want me to get
We're
the
we're no
building, too?
we're no wimpy bike riders. We're
I
ultra.
can't say that because they're not wimpy.
That's what you said.
All right. Yeah.
We're no wimpy bike riders. We're
Yeah,
ultra runners.
We're beyond tough.
We're beyond tough,
yeah.
yeah.
We're digging deep all
Yeah,
the way. So
all right.
yeah, we can't be worried about the weather. We'll take whatever the good Lord gives us.
Okay.
So the better it is, the better we like it.
Okay, you're not gonna say we're no wimpy bike riders.
No, I'm not going to say
Oh,
that.
darn it.
No, I'm not.
Even though he said it before. But